As we start discussing job costing and applying or allocating cost to jobs, we're going to review our T account structure with our inventory accounts and our cost of goods sold expense, and then we're going to add on to that. So first, recall that when we think through these accounts, we're going to draw a line here to denote the difference between our inventory accounts, which are assets, and our expense account, which is again a contra equity. And we're really going to start with the raw materials, the work in process, the finished goods, and the cost of goods sold. And so before, what we denoted was that all of our accounts that are inventory assets are going to have a beginning balance and an ending balance for each of these, because they're all going to start and end with something at the end of every period and the beginning of every period. And that is supposed to be a beginning balance. Okay. Remember, raw materials are increased by purchases. They're decreased by materials used. And before, we had spoken specifically about direct materials. Work in process then is increased by direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, and it's decreased by cost of goods manufactured. Finished goods is then increased by cost of goods manufactured. The total of these costs flow to finished goods. And when we sell finished goods, they reduce the balance of finished goods. That in turn is the point at which we increase our expense. Now, as we talk about job costing and applying cost to jobs is everything that happens in the work in process account. So that's where our focus is going to be. So we're going to expand this just a little bit, okay? And we're going to expand this because we're going to start looking at how costs flow through the accounts. So down here, I want you to think about two more, we're going to call them temporary tracking accounts, okay? So these are not assets or inventory. They're just simply accounts that we want to track some costs in. And those costs we're going to track factory labor and manufacturing overhead. Now they work the same way. Pluses on the left, minuses on the right, pluses on the left, minuses on the right. Okay, so let's first look at factory labor. Factory labor is going to be increased by all our factory wages and benefits. Anything payroll related for those individuals making the product. Okay, now when we think about factory labor, I want you to keep that in mind. Manufacturing overhead, same idea, but this is all our actual indirect costs. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now let's just start at the beginning. So originally we talked about with our raw materials account, if we use direct materials, we know that those are decreasing our raw materials account balance, and it's increasing work in process. So when we allocate direct materials to jobs, we're going to use a materials requisition slip, and that's going to increase our work in process for that job. Now remember, work in process can be in total or per job. Now, the other thing that's going to come out of raw materials is this thing called indirect materials, so IM. Well, the question might be, well, where do those need to go? Well, indirect materials is an indirect. So therefore, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Indirect materials never goes directly to the job or directly to WIP. Instead, it's going to come down here to manufacturing overhead, because we're going to have to allocate that overhead to all of our jobs. So now we're done with raw materials. Let's look at factory labor. So if we increased factory labor by all the wages of everybody that worked, we're going to decrease it by direct labor, again, used in the process. Now, we already saw direct labor go into work in process. Okay, let me draw some arrows on here to help you see these. Remember, indirect labor, those costs are going down into manufacturing overhead. I'm sorry, indirect materials. Now, direct labor, once it's used, is going directly into work in process. So never forget those three manufacturing costs. Now, we also have indirect labor. So guess where that goes? That is going to go into our overhead. So now we see where direct materials and direct labor come from, and we see where indirect materials and indirect labor go to. So now to wrap this process up, all we have to do is look at what to do with manufacturing overhead, because here it is. So I want you to now make a note. This is going to be what we refer to as allocated or applied manufacturing overhead. So that's got to come from somewhere, right? You got it. It's going to come from down here. So we are going to take out of manufacturing overhead all of our manufacturing overhead applied or allocated. Okay. So what that means is we are going to use an estimate, which we'll review further here in the next video. But we're going to use an estimate to apply that to jobs. And it's going to leave manufacturing overhead and it's going to go into work in process. So hopefully you can follow all of my lines here. Now, a couple of things I just want to mention. At the end of the day, factory labor, we want that to have a zero balance. Why? Because we want to make sure that all of the labor incurred gets allocated to the jobs or to manufacturing overhead to be allocated. Same thing with manufacturing overhead, but we're going to learn that we don't always know what the actual costs are going to be. And that's the whole reason why we allocate overhead to jobs, because we can't wait for those final bills. So even though we may get to a point where we do not equal zero, the goal is that we have to be, because we're never going to recognize more expense than we actually have. And so we're going to explore that in a couple of examples in the next video.